The Phoenix Suns have been an absolute disaster this season. Last year, they were pretty disappointing, finishing 6th in the West and getting swept in the first round, but we at least saw some glimpses of hope. This is a team who did play down to their competition at times. They had so many blown fourth quarter leads last season, but they also had games where they beat really good teams. They were walking into these contending teams' home arenas and competing with them and beating them in some games. And so even though last year was disappointing, we saw signs of hope. And the fact that you have Kevin Durant and Devin Booker on your team as well just gives you more reason to have optimism, because most teams don't have that much talent. But this season has just been absolutely horrible for the Suns. As I'm recording this video on Tuesday night, they're 27-30 and they're 11th in the West. They have a game later tonight against Memphis, which they'll probably lose. But even if they win, this is still going to be a team that's below 500 58 games into the season and currently sitting outside of the play-in 58 games into the season. And obviously this is a bad look considering the talent on this team. You have Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal as what's supposed to be your big three, and you can't even manage to make the play-in tournament. But what makes things even worse is that Phoenix has the second highest payroll in the entire league this season. So you're paying so much money, going over the luxury tax, going over the second apron, which just restricts you so much. And you're not even able to sniff the playoffs. And even if they do miraculously make their way into the playoffs, they're not doing anything in the first round. They're probably just going to get swept again like they did last season. So with that being said, it wasn't surprising that Kevin Durant was brought up in trade rumors at the trade deadline. And even though he wasn't traded at the trade deadline, everyone kind of is under the impression that he's most likely going to be traded in the summer. The Suns are going to try to just get some sort of assets back for him, and then maybe try to build around Devin Booker and build another contender around him. And while that sounds good in practice, I don't really know how realistic that is. From a talent perspective, there aren't too many players I would take over Kevin Durant. But we have to remember that he's getting up there in age. He's going to turn 37 in September, and he's also going into the last year of his contract. So if you trade for him, there's no guarantee that he's going to re-sign with you. He could just leave in free agency. And on top of that, something that people don't really talk about because I think they forgot it, a few years ago, Kevin Durant said that he might want to play the last year of his professional career overseas. And so if you think that he has maybe 3 or 4 years left playing professional basketball, and one of those years he wants to spend playing overseas, that just takes off one more year that he would be playing in the NBA. So if he only wants to play 2 or 3 more years in the NBA, as a GM, I wouldn't be willing to give up tons of picks and young assets to get him. We'll have to see what happens in the summer when he's most likely traded, but I'm expecting more of a good return than a great one. And on top of that, the Suns seem to be stuck with Bradley Beal for the next 2 seasons. He's going to be making $53 million next season, and then the year after that, he has a player option for $57 million, and he's definitely accepting that. And because he has that no trade clause in his contract, he's just impossible to move. He's already massively overpaid, and that kind of will draw teams away from trading for him. But the fact that he has a no trade clause just means that even if there's a team that actually wants to trade for him, Bradley Beal can just step in and say, no, I don't want to go to that team. And at this year's trade deadline, the only team that actually seemed somewhat interested in trading for Beal was the Milwaukee Bucks. And in theory, that sounds like a pretty good place to be traded. You get to play with Giannis and Damian Lillard, and even though the Bucks are viewed as a tier below teams like the Cavs or the Celtics, you can at least say that you're competing and you're making the playoffs. In Phoenix, you're not doing that, especially with how deep the West is. But there was a report that came out around the trade deadline stating that Bradley Beal would only waive his no-trade clause for a team that was contending, but also a team that resided in a warm weather city. He just relocated from Washington to Phoenix after being traded there, and he moved his whole family there. So I can see why he wouldn't want to just have to either uproot his family again or move to an entirely different city that's separate from them and be away from his family. I understand the human element of it and why Bradley Beal wouldn't want to be traded, even though the Suns situation is pretty bad right now. But if we're just looking at it from the Suns front office perspective, that just makes things so much more difficult. He already has very low trade value, And if he has very specific requests for where he would want to be traded, it just makes it virtually impossible to move him. So even if the Suns trade Durant and are able to achieve a little bit more cap flexibility, they're still going to be paying Devin Booker and Bradley Beal over $50 million each over the next 2 seasons. And that's not to mention the fact that Grayson Allen also is making a decent amount of money. Unless the Suns are able to make some miraculous moves that I'm just not anticipating, they seem like a team that's going to be pretty mediocre over the next 2 seasons. And sure, Bradley Beal's contract will be up in 2027, and Phoenix will have a lot more cap flexibility at that point. But still, that doesn't mean that Phoenix will just be in the clear and all of a sudden it will be so easy for them to build around Booker. Let's say Phoenix gets 3 first-round picks when they trade Kevin Durant. They're going to be trading him to a good team. That team is probably going to be finishing in the playoffs, which means their pick is going to be somewhere in the 20s. Sure, getting a first-round pick, especially 3 of them, would be really good, but a pick in the 20s is not a lock to be a good player or a contributing player. And then on top of that, Phoenix's own draft situation is just awful. Another thing Phoenix is going to have to consider is Devin Booker's timeline, because when Bradley Beal's contract expires in 2027, Devin Booker will be 31 years old. And if we look at the past as an indication of what could happen in the future, it's gonna take at least 4 to 5 years for the Suns to build a good contending team around Devin Booker. And that's assuming they're hitting on most of their draft picks and making the right signings and trades. If we look at Devin Booker's career, he was drafted in 2015, and when he was drafted to Phoenix, they were just absolutely awful. As I mentioned, Devin Booker was drafted in 2015, then DeAndre Ayton and Mikal Bridges were picked up in 2018, Cameron Johnson was drafted in 2019, and then obviously in 2020 they traded for Chris Paul. And looking back, the Suns did a really good job building around Booker. But even still, it took 5 years to build that contending level team around him. I don't see how we can be confident that Phoenix will be able to build the same level of team around Devin Booker as they did in the past, especially now when he's older and they have less assets and picks than they did in the past when they were building around him the first time. And I get that it can be very repetitive when a team is struggling or just kind of sitting in the middle of the pack, and then all of a sudden we start talking about trade rumors and how their star franchise player should be moved so that they can go into a rebuild. I get that that gets kind of repetitive and we get kind of annoyed with it. We'd like it if the narrative weren't always to move and trade that star, but rather try to keep them and build around them. I just don't think that, given the hole that the Suns have dug themselves into, that they're going to be able to dig themselves out of that hole and build another good contending team around Devin Booker. So I could see the front office saying, you know what, we are just going to cut our losses. We hate to have to trade this guy who was with us in the early days when we were absolutely terrible and he was just an amazing player. And then when we were able to build a team around him, he took us to the finals and nearly won us a championship. It's hard to trade a guy like that who's done so much for your franchise. But if the prospect of building a team around him just seems so challenging, then I can see the rationale in moving him and just trying to get as many assets as you can for him, even if he doesn't want to leave. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that since Matt Ishbia became owner of the Phoenix Suns, he has seemed to really prioritize the fans. For one, he's just instilled this ultra-aggressive mentality into the franchise, and even though that's kind of backfired on them, he has tried to build a good team. The ultra-aggressive mentality that he instilled got them Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal, which gave the Suns 3 star-level players, and even though it cost him lots of money to pay that payroll and pay all the players on this team, he's been willing to do it. And then on top of that, I've read stories about how he's lowered the concession prices so that people can come to the game, they can eat and drink, parents can bring their kids to games and bring their entire family and not completely just break their bank account to just buy some food and drinks at the games. So I could see a world in which Matt Ishbia says to the front office, look, we're not going to trade Devin Booker, we're going to try to build around him, because this is a guy who clearly means a lot to this franchise and means a lot to the fan base. He was with the team when they were awful, he was the best player on their 2021 team that nearly won the championship, and then even over the past few years when they've been in the middle of the pack and really disappointing, he hasn't caused any drama or requested a trade or asked out or anything like that. So I could see Matt Ishbia once again thinking of the fans and telling the front office not to trade Devin Booker. But like I've talked about in this video, from a team building perspective, I just don't really see how realistic it is for the Phoenix Suns to be able to put a really, really good team around Devin Booker again. And for that reason, it feels like a Devin Booker trade is inevitable at this point.